Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Siebelink, and the topic for today's presentation is the Lavender Scare and how the Republican Party manipulated the American public in the McCarthy era of the 1950s. Before I get started, I want to give a special shout out to my faculty mentor, Professor Christopher Sleeper, and the rest of the honors program for all of their support and encouragement during this project. Just to give a little idea of what was going on in American history during the post-World War II era of the 1950s. The United States was in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union after the fall of the Nazi Party in Europe in 1945. Berlin was under grabs by all of the victorious Allied powers, the United States predominantly on the side of democracy, and then the Soviet Unions and their brand of communism were all vying for control of war-torn Berlin. And this instigated a worldwide Cold War between democracy and communism that had the entire world on edge. In the United States, anxieties and fears were getting high, and certain Republicans within the United States government, namely Joseph McCarthy, shown here on the left, decided to start taking advantage of it for their own ends. They wanted to play upon the American public's paranoia to convince them that communists were infiltrating the United States government and that this was a government under the control of the Democrats for many, many years. They wanted to use it as an embarrassment of the Democrat Party in order to further their own agendas. Due to the international nature of the work of the Department of State, McCarthy and his fellow Republicans began to suspect that many of the alleged communist infiltrators in the United States government worked for the State Department. And so McCarthy began applying pressure to Department of State Undersecretary John Purifoy to release information on investigations that they had been doing along the same lines, trying to identify communist and other undesirable influences in the State Department. And while Purifoy refused to admit that he had communists under State Department employ, he was in fact forced to admit that he did have a number of homosexuals working for the State Department. Despite McCarthy's best efforts, he and his other Republicans were unable to gather too much evidence to back up their anti-communist beliefs. So instead, they decided to waste no time in jumping on the homosexual angle that Purifoy had alerted them to. And soon after, they began a campaign to rid the federal government of all homosexual employees, leading to what scholar David K. Johnson has named the Lavender Scare. Not long after they began their campaign against homosexuals working for the United States government, some Republicans began making claims that communism was somehow linked to homosexuality, and this mindset caused the ongoing Red Scare against communism to combine with the new Lavender Scare into what this author has deemed the Magenta Purge. And I've named it the Magenta Purge because, unlike the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare, which in this case combined with ideas of communism from the Red Scare, was less focused on inciting fear and anti-homosexual sentiment among the American people, and was instead primarily focused on identifying and terminating governmental employees that the Republicans considered to be homosexuals. And this was regardless as to whether or not they actually had communist ties or, in fact, were homosexuals. This presentation will examine how, by exposing homosexuality as a potential major security concern, manipulating politicians and the news media, and applying pressure to foreign allies and the United Nations, just how the Republicans were able to succeed in damaging the popularity of the Democrat Party in the early 1950s and set in motion the rise of the Republicans for years to come, and how that has global implications that still exist to this day. One of the first things that you need to understand about the Lavender Scare / Magenta Purge is that its origins date back far earlier than the 1950s. In fact, in the age of the American Revolution, Lieutenant Frederick Gotthold Ensslin was discharged from the Continental Army for charges of attempted sodomy and perjury, making him one of the very first federal government officials in the United States to be discharged from federal service due to alleged homosexuality. And this is a pattern that continued all throughout American history through the Civil War, through Spanish-American War, all the way through World War I, when Army intelligence and immigration officials got word of rumors that Berlin, Germany was a safe haven for immoral activity, including homosexuality, and thus they decided to implement far stringent interviewing and onboarding requirements for servicemen as well as immigrants coming from other countries. And these are policies that were expanded even further during World War II when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt um, flat out barred homosexuals from serving in the United States military. It's always an unwritten rule up until that point, but it became codified in the early stages of American involvement in World War II. And as a result, over 5,000 men and women were rejected by the military due to homosexuality or alleged homosexuality. Besides the United States military, the first American governmental agency to outright ban homosexuals from employment was, ironically, the State Department in 1947. It was a policy that was rarely enforced during the first few years of its existence. The government, up until that point, had an attitude of veiled tolerance, kind of a foreshadowing of the don't ask, don't tell of the 1990s. Their attitude was either reactionary or preventative, and very few homosexuals were terminated from their positions due to homosexuality during this time frame. But all of that changed after Purifoy's 1950s testimony in front of McCarthy. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned how the Republican Party attempted to create a link between communism and homosexuality. The reason this was the case was because there was an idea at the time that communists had either physical or mental defects, and at the time homosexuality was considered a major mental defect. And so they love to use the example of Colonel Alfred Radel of Austria from during the era of World War I, who was a spy for Russia and also a known homosexual. And this was the only example that the Republicans needed to use in order to create in the American public's mind and thus validate their efforts, was given an example of a communist who was also homosexual, and they relied on that throughout the Magenta Purge era to convince the American people and others in government that their cause was righteous. They did not want homosexuals being security risks because, in their eyes, homosexuals were also likely communists, and they couldn't tolerate either. Identifying these homosexuals with potential communist ties, the Republicans went on the offensive and instigated an in-depth screening of applicants for all federal employment, including the military, and launched internal investigations, primarily in the State Department, whenever a potential employee had even the slightest possibility of engaging in homosexual activity. It didn't matter if they engaged in one single homosexual act as a child. It doesn't matter if it was an ugly rumor. It doesn't matter if they had been completely closeted. Or in some cases, it didn't matter if they were homosexual at all or had ever entertained homosexual tendencies. Just the idea of linking a person with homosexuality was enough for the Republicans and the FBI and internal State Department auditors to pressure a person in resigning their position and then permanently banning them from government employment from that point forward. The purging of homosexuals from government employment was only a superficial goal of the Republicans. Their primary objective was to discredit the Democratic administration of Harry S. Truman and increase their own popularity after decades of Democratic control. The Democrats had been in power in both the presidency and Congress since the late 1920s, and the Republicans were eager to retake some of their lost glory. And one of the primary ways they accomplished this was by attacking many of the prominent Democrats at the time, such as they're referring to Democrat presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson as Alger Stevenson, embarrassing him by calling him the name of Alger Hiss, which was a known Soviet spy who, coincidentally, was rumored to be homosexual himself. So by smearing various candidates and officials in this way and trying to link them with homosexuality, even if there wasn't a homosexual bone in their body, was one way that they hoped to discredit and embarrass them to the point where the Republicans would come out on top in that particular election. Perhaps the most infamous example of the Republican smear campaign against Democrats was their treatment of Senator Lester Hunt of Wyoming. In 1953, his son, Lester Hunt Jr., was arrested in the state of Wyoming for soliciting an undercover male police officer for sex, and this was an opportunity that the Republicans, including President Dwight Eisenhower, took advantage of to begin applying pressure on the senator to resign. Eisenhower went so far as to offer him a different governmental position, more lucrative than the Senate, on the condition that he never again run for senatorial office, and he declined. But because him resigning would have given the Republican governor of Wyoming a chance to appoint a Republican to that position, the Republicans, led by Senator McCarthy, would not relent, and they continued to harass and hound Senator Lester Hunt with every tool that they had until finally the elderly senator had enough and ended up taking his own life. So not only were the Democrats permanently down a powerful senator, but the Republican governor of Wyoming was able to put a Republican in that position. After the Republicans won control of the American government via a supermajority in both houses of Congress and the White House in 1953, the Republicans in power began using their newfound influence to spread anti-homosexual ideas overseas to America's allies. One of the most prominent examples being the 1951 defection of Guy Burgess, an alleged homosexual spy of Great Britain to the Soviet Union, that inspired Republicans to put pressure on Great Britain and Scotland Yard to initiate their own version of the Magenta Purge. And this was led by Scotland Yard Commissioner Sir John Knott Bower, and became known as the Great Purge, which was nearly identical in every single aspect to the Lavender Purge that was going on in the United States. This was partly in thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, who sent numerous FBI agents to Britain to train Scotland Yard officials in anti-homosexual investigative techniques. The Republicans in power did not strictly set their sights on America's allies. In time, they decided to focus their attention on purging the entire United Nations of homosexual employees. This was led on by reports that many terminated State Department employees of the United States were finding employment with the United Nations, and after subtly implying that the U.S. government would cease funding of the UN if the employment of homosexuals continued, the UN Secretary General decided to order the immediate termination and barring of employment of all homosexual employees of the United Nations in response to the United States government threats. While many of the practices of the Magenta Purge and Lavender Scare ended in the late 60s and early 70s with a series of court victories for homosexuals, the effects of the Purge and Scare continue on to this day. As documentation continues to be unearthed and unsealed, more and more information about the Magenta Purge and other anti-homosexual Republican efforts continues to be located and studied. And because of this, there is no way to tell for certain how many people were affected by these actions. But one thing is for certain, the anti-homosexual bigotry experienced by homosexuals due to the manipulations of the Republican Party in the McCarthy era led to the ushering in of the gay liberation movement of the 1960s and organizations that continue to do amazing work for homosexuals and the LGBTQ community to this day.